Welcome back. Now we answer questions we receive from you, our viewers. If you have a question, visit our website, QuranSpeaks.com. Dr. Shabir, this is a question about the Sunni school of thought. What are the specific differences and practices of each Sunni school of thought, and what is the history behind them, specifically praying practices? What events led to these individual schools?
So there are four major schools of Islamic jurisprudence, is what we call them, within the Sunni realm. The first one, in terms of the historical emergence, is that of this, Imam Abu Hanifa. He was born about 80 years of the Hijrah, which means several decades after the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. He lived in Iraq, and he developed his school with many students there. And when we speak of a school, I don't mean like a school building. I mean that there is a body of scholarship that emerges with teacher and student, many students having their students and so on. So there is a way of thinking and way of summarizing all of the information and distilling the final rulings on issues that emerge. And that's called a school. That's running throughout history. And following that, there was the school of Imam Malik, who was based in Medina, in the place where the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, spent the last years of his life. And Imam Malik was born in the year 93, so 13 years younger than Imam Abu Hanifa. Now, if I stick with these two for the moment, we will get to understand how differences emerge. So in Iraq, some people say, well, because that was far from the scene of where the companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him, mostly lived, there was not that much information about the details of the Prophet's practice. So there was more room for interpretation. Because, you know, when you have something reported from the Prophet, you feel obliged to follow that, and you feel reticent to offer your own opinion on the matter. But in Iraq, they had a little bit more of a leverage this way, because they had less reports and they exercised more opinion, and they emphasized the Quranic text. So if something was clearly derived from the text of the Quran, even if somebody came and said, well, we have a report from the Prophet saying something different, they would prefer to go with what is clear from the Quran rather than to go with what somebody's reporting, because they have a suspicion that when people report things, the reports could change from one person to another, especially in the early days when these reports were given by word of mouth rather than to be put into writing or carved in stone. Now, for Imam Malik, on the other hand, he was right there in Medina where many of the companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him, lived, where the Prophet himself lived the last years of his life, and where the practices of Islam were demonstrated for all and sundry. So for Imam Malik, what was being done in Medina, the practices there, the way of praying, the details and so on, all of this must be the real way of the Prophet, peace be upon him. And so he preferred that. So differences naturally arose because of the two different methods that were followed, one in Iraq, another in Medina. Now,
did they ever interact at a very early time?
Yes, they did. Of course, there was a lot of interaction between Muslims, especially like those who are in Iraq, would come to Mecca and Medina, to Mecca to perform the Hajj, to Medina to visit the mosque of the Prophet, peace be upon him. And so they were aware of what is going on, but they have different lenses through which they are looking at the same information. So from the lens of Imam Malik, it looks like whatever is done in Medina, this is it. But from the lens of the Iraqis, like they're not so much committed to the situation in Medina, they're a little bit freer to think more globally in terms of the objectives behind things, the spirit behind things, and so on. And so they take a slightly more rational approach rather than a traditional approach of saying, this is the tradition, just follow it. So the two different approaches, you have two different ways emerging. Now, from the way of Imam Malik, following the tradition, basically, we have another later scholar, Al-Imam ash-Shafi'i, who took this method, but he wanted to emphasize more, not just simply the generally known practice of Medina, but he wanted to make sure that somebody can attest to a specific practice being done by the Prophet, peace be upon him, himself. It's not just for him sufficient that a large number of people from that generation that is close to the time of the Prophet are following a particular thing or doing something one way. He wants to know, is there a specific report that can be attested and that could be traced all the way back to the Prophet, peace be upon him? For example, did the Prophet say specifically do this? Or is there a report saying that he did specifically this? So Imam ash-Shafi'i could have this luxury of looking at the information this way because at his time, people have started to develop this into a science. So a person born in that milieu, such as Imam ash-Shafi'i, would have the feeling that we're dealing here with an exact science. If we say that the hadith is graded authentic, then we have full confidence that it really is so. Whereas a person born in an earlier time, when the science was not so exact, would not have that confidence. So Imam ash-Shafi'i has that confidence, and so he emerges with a system of thought that is more clearly dependent on the specific reports rather than the general practice. Coming later than Imam ash-Shafi'i is Ahmad bin Hanbal. And he becomes the eponym of what we might describe now as the fourth school. And in his time, the hadiths have even more blossomed to fruition. And so he compiled a book of 30,000 hadiths, whereas by comparison, an Imam Malik compiled a book that has only about 500 hadiths from the Prophet, peace be upon him, himself, and then other reports from others. Ahmad bin Hanbal has 30,000. So you can see the vast difference. If you want to know what did the Prophet, peace be upon him, said on subjects from A to Z, in Imam Malik's Muwatta, you wouldn't find so many hadiths dealing with the various subjects. But in Imam Ahmad's collection, you find hadiths galore. What difference does it make? It means that when you're armed with Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal's collection of 30,000 hadiths, there's less room for opinions and for you to think about things because you have specific instructions now almost on everything from A to Z. And so the faith and the practice emerged that way to become very literalistic. And some people took it even further than this. Dawood ibn Hazm emerged with what is referred to as the Zahiri school, and that took things even ultra-literally. A lot of that literalism is there in the Hambali methodology as well, and it has become in modern times actually somewhat fused with the Hambali methodology, and so we find that in some places, like for example in Saudi Arabia, where the Hambali school has become the school by default that is known and practiced and whose laws are implemented in the country, there we find a more literalistic application of certain laws. Whereas, for example, in some of the parts of the world where you have the Hanafi school in practice, you will find more of a sort of liberal is not the right term, but a more rational approach where people might be looking at the objectives behind the law and the spirit behind things rather than the literal application. So
what does this mean? You've mentioned these four different schools. What does that mean for the diversity of the practice of Islam?
It means that Muslims have to accept a diversity. And in fact, Muslims have generally learned to live with this diversity. Maybe the common people are surprised if they've only been accustomed to one thing, and then they go into another area and they find that people are practicing things slightly differently. It'll be kind of odd for them. But the scholars know of this diversity. They just have implemented one system in one area of the world because that's easier to teach people. It's easier to teach the common folks one system than to tell them theoretically, it could be any one of these four systems.
So does it just affect, little things like the details of prayer, or does it affect wider theological issues as well?
The theological issues, not so much, although there are some theological issues which are are scratched, you can say, by these different approaches and so on. But more so, it's the practices, and even with the practices, it's not the core of the practice. So among these four schools, for example, all of them agree that we are to have 5 prayers. All of them agree that the fard, or the obligatory components of the prayers, are these much: 2 rakats of Fajr in the morning, 4 for the afternoon prayer, 4 for the late afternoon, 3 for the prayer right after sunset, and 4 late at night. But then around this we have other prayers, like what are we to say about the witr prayer? How many rakats is that? Is it 3, or is it just any other odd number, 1 to 7, for example? And does it have to be prayed this way or that way? And then what about the other prayers, which might be called sunnah? For the Dhuhr prayer, for example, the afternoon prayer, is it 2 rakats before the fard, or is it 4 rakats before the fard, and so on. So we have some differences around the core. So there is a core that is agreed upon by all, and then the differences around them.
Does it matter which of these schools of thought a person follows?
Well, generally, there is an agreement among the scholars of these 4 schools that you can follow any one of these 4, and you are rightly guided. So even though it may so happen that in one school may rule something to be permissible, let's say to eat. So one school says this food is permissible to eat, but the other school says, no, this is haram, you can't eat that. So you might have 2 Muslims side by side, and one is eating it because his school says it's permitted. The other one is avoiding it because his school says it is impermissible, haram. It is a sin to eat. But he, while avoiding it for himself, he has to accept that his brother or sister in faith is following a system. Here we're looking at the system of thought. It is a system of thought that guided the followers of that school to a certain conclusion. The conclusion could be wrong, because you can't have both conclusions right. This thing is halal and haram at the same time. Or God ruled this to be halal for the Shafi'is, but haram for the Hanafis. No, it's God ruled one thing, but we don't know what that one thing is. And 2 different opinions arose. Some people said it's this thing, and some people said it's this thing. So we have to accept that in principle, because they're following a good methodology, they're just trying to find the right way, but they were looking at it through different lenses, and we have different lenses. And we can't have all of the same lenses, just like we can't take out the lenses from our own eyes and put it in the other person's eye. We're going to see things differently. And it was seen differently in one school. Faithfully, they have arrived at this conclusion, so we leave them to their conclusion. And we know that God is not going to penalize them for reaching that conclusion, because they reach that conclusion through good scholarship. It just so happens that there are some things which are so obscure in the tradition that the best of our scholars are going to arrive at 2 different opinions about it. Yeah.
So Dr. Shabir, one last question. Is it possible for a Muslim to pick and choose between the schools of thought in terms of the way they practice Islam?
Yeah, well, generally for the common folks, the choice is not available generally, because what happens in practice is that a school becomes widespread in a certain area. I mean, let's think about before the schools became widespread, there were just these scholars around. So one might go to Iraq and find Imam Abu Hanifa is teaching there. One might go to Medina and find that Imam Malik is teaching there. And you ask me about interactions. One of the primary students of Imam Abu Hanifa, Muhammad bin Hassan al-Shaybani, went to Medina, and he studied Imam Malik's book, the Muwatta, and he compiled his own edition of the Muwatta. So they know the same information, they're students of each other, and so on. There is this kind of interaction. But now, some people may go to Iraq and follow Imam Abu Hanifa there. Some people may be living in Medina, they're following Imam Malik. It'll be difficult for them in Medina to follow Imam Abu Hanifa because he's far away, and they don't have the telephone to call each other every day and find out, what's the new thinking about new issues arising. So people tend to follow the scholarship in their area. Now, this scholarship becomes well entrenched in a certain area. People who are born in that area naturally tend to follow that. So that's why you will find people from the Indo-Pak subcontinent, naturally, they mostly follow the Hanafi school. People in Saudi Arabia, mostly the Hambali school, because that's what is prevalent there. So the common people do not generally have this kind of luxury of following one or another.
But they do in Canada, right?
Because no, in Canada, people are all mixed up. Yeah, but I wanted to make the distinction that the scholars have the responsibility to know what is right and to follow what is right. So a scholar may be convinced of a particular school and follow that. They may be convinced that a particular school is more to the point, but they may continue to abide by the school that is popularly followed in their area. And then a good example of this was Shabir Ally of Delhi. Because he lived in Delhi, he abided by the Hanafi school because that was widespread there. But by conviction, he thought that the Shafi'i school is more to the point. But of course, he doesn't want to confuse the common folks, and because the common folk are not going to be able to absorb two schools at once. It's enough to learn one with all of its details and to do it right. Now, in our cosmopolitan situation, here we are in the Toronto area with people from all around the world following a wide variety of schools.
You go to a mosque and the person beside you might be praying differently.
Yeah.
The person in front of you might be praying completely different.
Yeah. So first we have to come to that position of tolerance to recognize that these are a variety of practices that are known in Muslim scholarship, widely acclaimed and acknowledged and verified to be the product of sound methodology. So they're all acceptable, but acceptable for the person who has been taught that way. We're not going to do something without being taught. We don't invent by ourselves, or we don't say, that looks like something nice, let me just try that for a change. No, you should be following sound scholarship. You should be, because ultimately you want to follow what God and his messenger said. You want to follow what God said in the Quran, what the messenger depicted in his life. And because common folks do not have the acumen not that we don't have the intelligence, we do, but we have devoted our intelligence to other areas of study. Somebody's become an accountant, somebody's become an engineer, somebody's become a medical doctor, and they're experts in all of these fields. But there are experts also in the field of interpreting the Quran and getting a sense of the life example of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and distilling all of that information into the finer points of Islamic law and practice. So we have to consult those people to know what is the Islamic law and practice. So long as you're learning from a qualified teacher, then you're fine, because you're doing what that qualified teacher is distilling from God's book and from the life example of the Prophet, peace be upon him. So we don't have the luxury of mixing and matching in this way. So the first level is the tolerance, to accept that there is this variety. But the second level is to go deeper and to think about these differences, how they arose, and to realize that we can't insist on these points, because not only do we have to be tolerant for the other person who is doing something different, but we also have to be flexible with our own tradition, knowing that if these points are so obscure that scholars cannot really be sure what is the point, some arrive at A and some arrive at not A at the same time, and knowing that they cannot both be true, that means we have a sort of gentlemanly agreement that says, let's agree that you're going to do A and I'm going to do not A, and we're both fine. So this is a kind of gentlemanly agreement that says, let's not argue the point, let's just do our own thing. But it means that we cannot be sure either about A or about its opposite. And so we cannot be sure and insist upon these practices. It means that we should have a greater degree of flexibility in the application of Islamic law when it comes to these details, because the details are not so firm.
Thank you, Dr. Shabir. That was really insightful and interesting. I appreciate your thoughts.
If you enjoyed this video, click like and subscribe. And please donate to support our work at QuranSpeaks.com.